Hey everyone, welcome to the Sex, Bodies, and Cinema podcast. I'm Jason Good, one of the co-hosts of the show, along with Ashley Rose. This podcast takes a close look at films that explore sexuality and embodiment with the aim to make space for what is, for many of us, a taboo subject. I'm a former screenwriter and director, and Ashley is a former actor. Both of us now work in the field of somatic sex education. You can find out more about Ashley and her work at ashleyelizabethrose.ca. You can find me at somarelating.ca. There you will find my hidden relationship patterns quiz that will help you identify some of the issues we often discuss in these episodes. It's free with your email, and you'll receive a personalized ebook that unpacks what came up for you and offers suggestions for improving how you show up in relationships. Go to the show notes and click on the link to take it today. Today's film is Paul Verhoeven's 1992 film Basic Instinct. Basic Instinct is about a violent police detective played by Michael Douglas who investigates a brutal murder that might involve a manipulative and seductive novelist played by Sharon Stone. You'll find links in the show notes pertaining to some of the topics covered. Without further delay, here is our episode on Paul Verhoeven's Basic Instinct.
What's your new book about?
A detective. He falls for the wrong woman.
What happens?
She kills him.
What do you think of the trailer?
That is a wonderful 90s. So 90s.
Right?
God, I love the music and the hoopla. I don't know how else to say it.
It accurately reflects the movie except for the music. Like, there's no music like that in the movie.
No, that's true.
I suppose the club scene has music like that, but the music's actually quite different, which we'll talk about later. But
Yeah, but it does seem like they're trying to say, come on in, it'll be fun. Wow, what are you going to discover?
yeah,
You know?
it was pretty good. Pretty good trailer.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is Sex, Bodies, and Cinema. I'm Jason.
I'm Ashley.
This is a podcast about the films that tackle the subjects of sexuality and embodiment. It's a conversation show where we'll unpack the films from our own perspective as both former artists and practicing somatic sex educators. As you can tell from the trailer, today's film is 1992's Basic Instinct, written by Joe Eszterhas and directed by Paul Verhoeven. Basic Instinct is about a violent police detective who investigates a brutal murder that might involve a manipulative and seductive novelist, played by Sharon Stone, of course. So what's your relationship to Basic Instinct? Have you seen it? You had seen it before?
It's not profound, but I'd seen it before, and I thought, I didn't take it too seriously. I think I thought, oh, it's risque. I think I frowned a lot. I think I was kind of like, oh man, like, yeah, it didn't capture me when I was more irritated by it, and also liked some of the play between the characters, but I was neither a Michael Douglas fan or a Sharon Stone fan at the time. I was a fan of the actor that plays the best friend, Gus. Yeah, I thought he was a great actor. And I wasn't really aware of Jan Triplehorn at that time. So a lot of the...
I think that was her first film.
Was that her first film?
I believe that was her first film.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, good for her. I thought she did a great job. Yeah, so I think I was at a stage of life where I felt annoyed by things that were overly dramatic and complex when I was more into just like human relationships. I was like, oh God, so dramatic and like murder and sex and intrigue. Yeah, so that was before. How about you?
Yeah, so 92, I'm still in high school, and whenever we cover films in the 80s and 90s, this will be a theme for me, which was, as a very religious kid, this was obviously a film that should not be viewed by anyone, especially me. So I didn't go anywhere near the film, although I have a very distinct memory of my first year at a Christian private university, and some of the guys in the dorm were all watching it in someone's room, and I was scandalized. They were watching Basic Instinct.
Wow. When you're supposed to be working with your basic instinct.
That's right.
Towards God.
You're
like,
supposed to be
eradicating it.
Shoving them down.
Shoving them down, yes. Yeah.
And then I never really revisited, I think, until just a couple of years ago, after I'd done the somatic sex education training. I was just in obviously a completely different place. 30 years later. And watched it and was like, this is a masterpiece.
Really? Masterpiece. Very cool. Okay.
On various levels. But I was able to, since I was watching it without this sort of shame and the sort of performance of being evangelical, and I just like took the film in for what I thought the director was trying to do. And I appreciated it a lot.
Did it turn you on?
Did it turn me on? Yeah, sure.
Options for disclosure.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have said that before you forced you to answer.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's some genuine moments of sexiness in the film. I'm just thinking back. I mean, some of it is obviously violent, some of it's manipulative, but yeah, I think there's genuine titillation, and I think that's the director's point. What was the most recent viewing for you like then, if before you judged it?
Oh, this last time I had a lot more respect for the film, both in how it was positioned within the timeline that it was. I mean, I don't think it's like profound or anything, but I do think there's good performances. I do think it's a different era of acting, so that it's a broader stroke than we would use right now, because right now everything's so like, you want to make sure that people don't even know you're acting. Like there's a real minimalist, super authentic vibe going through comedy as well as drama right now. Understated, I would say. The director, Mort Ranson, do you know him? He did Margaret's Museum. Canadian,
Sure, yeah.
director. He used to train actors, and he would use something called a janitor test. And he would say, if I'm walking by and I'm just the janitor sweeping the hall and someone's having a fight or a loving discussion or something, he'd want to feel like he knew it wasn't acting. So he called that the janitor test. I always thought that always stuck with me. Yeah, he's because I think he's a powerful director that is of that ilk. Anyway, so broader strokes in this.
Can I interrupt you? That reminds me of the acting coach, Uta Hagen.
Yeah. Respect for acting.
And she would talk about if two people are acting on stage and then a cat were to just walk onto the stage, everyone's going to watch the cat.
The cat.
Why?
Yeah.
And why is that? They know it's real. They know it's grounded. They know it's authentic. Even if the people on the stage are doing big actorly things, we're going to be drawn towards the cat.
Absolutely.
Which sort of is in line with
exactly,
what you're
because
saying.
they're just completely authentic. Yeah. I thought Sharon Stone's performance was wonderful. I thought Michael Douglas's was wonderful. I thought it was funny, like in terms of the era and part of how it portrayed things. And I was still rolling my eyes a little bit like, oh gosh, really? You're going to really get wrapped? Oh, okay, there you go. Oh, you're making that choice again. But I thought it also raised some interesting questions. I liked it. I liked it a lot more. I thought it was solid, and masterpiece is a bit far from me. But
that's all right.
I think
we'll discuss it.
Okay.
Even some of your critiques
Should sell me.
that you're talking about, which we'll get into, I'm like, yeah, I think that's the point. I think that's the point.
Oh, cool. Okay.
That's the point.
I want to hear.
So yeah, let's talk about, Paul Verhoeven is the director. Do you have opinions on Paul Verhoeven? Have you thought about Paul Verhoeven? Have you watched his films?
Not. What about
So you have no relationship to Paul
pinging
Verhoeven.
that back to you.
Okay, yeah. So he's a Dutch filmmaker who moved to Hollywood, and his first American film, as I understand it, was RoboCop. And I think of him as a director who is playing with American Hollywood styles and storytelling, turning it on its head, turning a mirror back at the audience. So RoboCop is like showing America what their Jesus is. Like there's this sort of Christian nationalism and violence that are intertwined, and RoboCop is his thesis on American Jesus.
Wow.
Right to the point of like his hands get pierced, dies and comes back to life. And I think it's an incredible, brilliant film. Then Total Recall is another film he did. I enjoy Total Recall. I have less opinions about that. I haven't thought that much about that film. But then the film even like Starship Troopers, where he's
Oh, that one I loved. I didn't know that was him.
Yeah, and he's intentionally telling the story. He's telling an action movie story from a fascist point of view. So if you're not paying attention, it's just this kind of cool sci-fi film. But if you pay attention, they're kind of representing like a Nazi fascist kind of regime, and he's telling it through their eyes. Again, just kind of flipping things upside down. Hollow Man. More recently, I finally saw his movie Black Book, which is like set in Europe. It's not a Hollywood film. But yeah, he has a lot of interesting films, and I think he's intentionally playing with Hollywood tropes and flipping them upside down or turning them on us and showing us what we're really into. What about Michael Douglas?
Was never, again, someone I like now. He's kind of like a Tom Cruise for me, where I'm not really drawn to their energy, but I respect them as people. Like, I think they're great actors. There's just something energetically that doesn't always jive. And now, also he's mellowed, he's older. But yeah, I've always found him kind of cock of the walk. It's not the energy that I'm most compelled by. And yet in this, I had respect for him, like how great he looked. For his age. So
he and I are the same age. Like him in Basic Instinct and me right now. we are the same age. He looked amazing.
Did you do the bathroom scene though? That's what we need to know.
Right.
Yeah, like, I mean, he looks great. I think he does an amazing job of portraying this particular character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked him in this. And I have respect for him, a lot of respect.
Yeah, I think he is perfect for this. He's just an interesting guy. Part of the subtext, I think, of this film is that he's the son of like a Hollywood legend in Kirk Douglas. And the director is playing with that because one of the supporting characters starred with his dad in another film. But he's such an interesting guy because he tried to break into films, couldn't do it, so he started producing films, won an Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because he couldn't get the film made with himself in it, but he got it made with Jack Nicholson in it.
Right. And they became friends for life.
And then he started to do some supporting roles, like the names are failing me at this point. Then he got cast in TV, and then he finally made his way back into film. And it seems like he understands his persona, like, so exactly what you described, which is why in Wall Street, he's great. So my relationship to him is like Romancing the Stone.
Oh, okay.
So the Zemeckis film from the early 80s,
Yes.
where that's what he is. He's actually just a prick.
Yeah.
And
And he does it well.
but somehow you're kind of used to, he's an asshole, but you understand he's the protagonist and you kind of go with him despite that, or at least you track with him.
I have a story about that later when we get further down the story,
Okay, yeah.
the line, yeah.
Disclosure comes to mind as another 90s kind of sexy thriller. And my favorite film is David Fincher's The Game, which dissects him as this asshole character. And what if he's in a scenario that forces him essentially to humble himself and get to his knees and face himself truly. Yeah, so he's interesting, and I think he
doesn't get stuck there.
Yeah.
But that's what he's really where his strength lies.
And in this film, if you stop and think about it, this is a bad guy. He makes bad choices over and over and over and over and over again. But for whatever reason, we go along with him as the protagonist. But he's not a good guy.
Yeah, the writer said some really interesting things about how both of those characters, both the main characters, kind of sense a certain evil in each other and they want to dance with it. And he called it cat and cat, a cat and cat game. And so it wasn't about likability. It was really about what do you allow inside yourself, which obviously is part of the theme. What permissions do you give for your whole self to be there? So not moderating anything with conscience, but really going for the thing you actually want, purely, moment to moment. So it's cool.
Well, speaking of the other cat then involved in that, Sharon Stone, what was your relationship with Sharon Stone as a performer? When did she get on your radar?
She got on my radar early because she was famous at this point. So I would have been 10 when Basic Instinct came out. So I saw it later in my teens. But I was aware of her and I wasn't particularly compelled. Now, again, I heard her journey with making this movie, her rise to fame. And I've seen interviews that she's done for Basic Instinct, and I respect her intelligence, her beauty, her journey throughout Hollywood, her family relationships, all the way she was pedestalized and cut down for this movie, which I think is emblematic of exactly, maybe part of what the film was trying to say, but definitely the condition of women within Hollywood and within, I would say, the North Americas. It presents itself differently everywhere, but yeah, I think she's amazing and strong and bright. And I think she nailed this. I'm just so excited to talk about how she ousted any other competition. She was not the favorite for this role, right? And Michael Douglas had other names on the ticket, right? He suggested to me more Michelle Pfeiffer.
I've heard Julia Roberts
Julia
as well,
Roberts, really?
which is wrong. She would not be good in this role.
Oh, yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could see someone like Pfeiffer or Moore pulling it off, but Pfeiffer was quoted as saying, I'm too much of a prude. Like, my dad was alive and I'm a conservative. Like, I'll do a shoulder shot or something. So, but what's amazing is that Douglas was not open to her. Most people weren't. And the director just said, fine, I'll see many, many women, but it has to compete with Sharon's taped audition. And it just never did. I think that's amazing. Respect.
Yeah, she's incredible in this movie. I think it is one of those, like, you could make an argument for an Oscar nomination. She just holds the screen. Every scene she's in pops. I don't think I'd ever heard of her before this film. I know she had other small roles, and certainly watching Total Recall, she has a really fun role in Total Recall, but I don't think I would have seen it before this movie. I was aware I knew Basic Instinct. It was obviously a movie I was trying to avoid, but then she started to have other roles after that. So I believe I saw her in The Specialist. I certainly remember the Michael Crichton adaptation Sphere that she's in.
But she did Sliver too. I forgot about that.
You're right, yes.
Erotic thriller.
Yeah. That's right. But she's one of those actors where she'll just always be associated with this one role, I would think.
Another thing, I really liked a lot of what the writer said about this film and the politics surrounding it, which got really muddy and complex for everyone involved, both the actors, the producers, the writers, like the whole complex of what was bringing the movie together. And he said that one scene that she does, the interrogation scene, which we'll talk about, became so much the forefront that her acting was missed. And he just said, there's a reason why this film has lasted over time, and it's Sharon. That's what he said. He said that performance is just, it gets overshadowed by what other people are paying attention to, but her acting is right there.
There's an early scene where you first meet her and she's at her beach house and it's overlooking the water, and she just holds that scene with Michael Douglas. Like, that's their first scene together. It's not the interrogation scene. You just watch that scene and you know, wow, this is a movie star. She knows exactly what movie she's making and she's just dialed in exactly right. The movie holds together because of her.
And I do appreciate the moments in the film where she appears as more vulnerable. Of course, we never know if that's manipulation or if that's mimicking non-sociopathic behavior or if that's genuine.
There's so much to talk about with Basic Instinct. As I was telling you before we recorded this, that I think this is the erotic thriller that all other erotic thrillers are measured by. And for good reason. I think there's a lot of interesting things to unpack. But we'll move into the spoiler section of the podcast where we'll just go through the beats of the film, unpack them, and at the end come back to some of the larger themes that we still want to discuss. So let's jump into that. What stood out for me was even just the opening credits are over like a reflective, it's just like shadows, light play over this triangular reflective surface, which the film we'll get into is very Hitchcockian. The credit sequence, I think, is telling us something. And then the opening shot, the actual opening recorded shot, photograph shot, is a mirror as we see two people having sex. So I do think the director is signaling something here around pointing this genre back at the audience. Film noir, erotic thriller, whatever we want to call it. It's both, I think. So anyways, opening shot. And then we jump into a wild sex scene that ends in a brutal murder.
Yes. We come to fear the leaning back.
Yes, that's the signal. When she's riding him and leans back, death is about to follow.
Yes. Be careful of the lean back.
The version that we watch now is the unrated version. So when it came out in theaters, they cut some things, including from this scene. There's the face of the victim, Johnny Boz, who's this retired rock legend, is pierced with the ice pick that ultimately murders him. So even that scene
I didn't see that part, but I can't handle that. But
so with sex and a murder, and the person who murders him has bright blonde hair, but we don't see their face. So is it Sharon Stone, we ask later, or someone else, some other character? Her character is Catherine Trammell. Then we jump into the cops arrive. It's a crime scene. We find out this murdered person, Johnny Boz, was a political donor, very wealthy. What I appreciated was Michael Douglas comes on. There's all these jokes around cum stains, and he even turns the stereo on by accident, and we start to get a sense of the police department's relationship to him. But we don't front load it with backstory, setup. We get
it's not very expository, right?
No.
Yeah.
We just get where someone dies in a very violent and sexual scene. Michael Douglas arrives and we're off.
Yes. I also think we are signaled right away to look at boundaries and, well, I don't know if this was like appropriateness, right? There's signals of appropriateness all over the place. So someone's just passed and everyone's making jokes. They're completely disconnected from what's happening. So that's the first time I saw that.
So then they need to find the girlfriend. So that's Michael Douglas and his partner, Gus. They're tasked with tracking down the girlfriend and interviewing her, getting a statement. They go to her house. We meet Roxy, who they at first think it's Catherine Trammell, but that's actually her girlfriend. She sends them to the beach house. So it turns out Sharon Stone's character, Catherine, is very wealthy. This is all set in San Francisco. And this is the first, for me, there's this long, I would call it a drone shot now, but it's a helicopter shot of them driving along the coast to get to the beach house, which is very Hitchcockian. To me, right away, he's signaling what we're doing here. And I might add as well that the other day, as I was doing some other work, I thought I would put on the Basic Instinct soundtrack and just like, what is this? Because it got nominated for an Oscar. Let's just listen to it. I don't know that I'm always paying attention to it when I watch the film. And I start listening to it and I'm like, this is a Hitchcock movie. And I pulled up Vertigo. We're set in San Francisco, very similar themes, and listened to them side by side. And they're not identical, but they're very similar. You could just toggle back and forth and you think you're in the same movie. So I want to just point out that as this film is being presented to us, there's multiple layers of conversation. Like you can just watch the film, be titillated and enjoy it for if you like sex and violence. But there is another layer to it where the director is in conversation with Hitchcockian movies, American film noir, which is a uniquely American genre that came out of America, and is signaling that he's going to play with some of those ideas. So then we meet Sharon Stone, and as I said, I found her compelling right from the get-go. It's this gorgeous scene with the ocean in the background. The light is perfect. The cinematographer is Jan de Bont, who went on to direct Speed and other movies himself. But it's just beautiful. And we get right from the start, she's very provocative. Do you remember some of her dialogue from that scene?
Just, you can tell she doesn't feel threatened. And anything they volley at her, she shows them the holes in their questions. So part of police interrogation might be inferences, a bit of bullying, pressure, right? And she just never submits to any of the pressure. So I do know that they tried to take her in, I think.
I can't remember that. What I was thinking of was they go, "Were you dating him?" And she's like, "No, I was fucking him." And they're a little shocked by that. And that comes up a couple of times in the film where she just owns that, like, that there wasn't a relationship. It was just about sex.
Or I tried the sex, and then it really became, he was pleasing me, therefore I took my pleasure, that kind of thing.
I'll talk about other scenes and how they were shot later, but this scene is pretty conventionally shot, although they do focus a lot on close-ups. So we're really tight. We're cutting back and forth, and we're tight on Michael Douglas. We're tight on Gus. We have a 2-shot with Gus and Michael Douglas. And then we're just tight on their faces, and it's just about how they're owning the space, they're reacting to each other, how they're sizing each other up, and then occasionally cutting back to this amazing vista in the background.
I do think it's really interesting how Gus reacts to her versus Nick, because Gus is feeling defeated and annoyed, and Nick's like, she's got our number, and he likes the ante.
So then we get the scene where he is back in the office and he has his police-mandated psychological sessions with Beth, who is the police psychologist or is contracted by the police to do counseling of some kind. And we start to understand that Nick, so Michael Douglas's character, Nick, does have a backstory that is relevant to this story. It's little bits of it unfold, but we know that there's some kind of drinking problem. He's done drugs, and then he has to report in or at least meet with Beth occasionally to update the situation. We also discover in that scene that they had some kind of affair at some point.
So she's not very, like you wrote here, things are fine, was one of the things that he said, and any self-respecting psychiatrist wouldn't stop there, for sure. So you can kind of tell that she's not putting the heat on him, so there's some kind of affinity or respect or something, and then you learn that there's actually a history. Boundaries.
Yeah.
Boundaries. We learn that he's a part of an IA investigation, internal affairs, but it's interesting as the movie evolves to see how exposed their relationship is and that people actually refer to them sleeping together, because it just seems like, again, this inappropriate thing that has been set on its side because of sexuality. And also that the AI people would be really concerned about Nick, but not so much about she could still sign off at that. So there's no considered bias there, even though they're internal affairs, which is all about bias. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. At the end of the scene, as he walks away, she says, "I still miss you, Nick." And she's the one character that I don't know if she's a poorly written character or if in the end she's just a chameleon. Like, I'm not sure what the intention is there, in that she's very needy. She accommodates, but there's little hints through the movie that maybe it's strategic, a tactic.
Yes, we have the juxtaposition through the whole film of these two women, right? And I think it's really interesting to have someone who just claims their power and is all power-based and dominant-based, and then there's one who's like a pursuer, who's an anxious pursuer. So we see two different relationships to power already. Nothing too relational, like in a healthy relational sphere, but I think the Sharon Stone narrative takes up so much space that we don't always unpack the relationship with Beth, but I think it's really intriguing as well.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great way of putting that. Thank you. So we get back into the police department and we're finding out more details. We find out Catherine is smart with degrees in psychology and literature and enormously rich. Her parents are dead. Her fiance is dead. And that she's a novelist and she wrote a book where the plot points mimic the murder that's just happened.
Hiding in plain sight, perhaps.
And then we get into a psychological profile. So Stephen Tobolowsky pops up here, who's a character actor that I really like. I think of him in Groundhog Day as Ned. And so this is like one of those scenes again where I think the tone of the movie is very consistent, which is super heightened to the point of almost absurdity, except that it's so beautifully shot and crafted. We have movie stars delivering the lines, but it's kind of nuts, right? Like, so in this scene, Stephen Tobolowsky's playing this profiler and he's like, you either have like a devious, diabolical mind and psychopath or someone with an absolute hatred and utter lack of respect for human life. And it's these tight close-ups of his face.
Meaning import.
Yeah. And none of these meetings would ever take place like this in the real world. They're just incredibly heightened. I appreciate that like Gus, so this is Michael Douglas's character's Nick's partner. He's always the guy who's like, I don't get it. Explain it in regular terms. Like he's like trying to make sense. And he's like the voice of reason.
Yeah, keeping it real.
Yeah.
Break it down for me. I also think the score does that same type of comedy that you're talking about. So you've got the visual, like the close-ups and stuff, and then sometimes the violins just go crazy. Right. Yes. Like with these chase scenes down the highway. It's really funny.
So then we get a scene where they're deciding where they're going to bring Catherine in for questioning. And this is when I started to notice the lighting in this movie is so on the nose, but perfectly done in the sense that almost every place in the police department and a lot of other locations, it's all through blinds. So it has that classic like film noir lines on the wall, lines on the face, like Double Indemnity. The Billy Wilder film noir is one that comes to mind for me, where the blinds are just this motif where, you know, there's light and darkness. You're kind of seeing partially what's going on.
Just like the credits you were talking about, that triangulated light.
But what's so funny about Verhoeven's film here is that it's everywhere. They're walking in the hallway and there's grating over the full fluorescent lights above them. So even as they walk in a hallway, it looks like they've got that blind light, I'm not sure what else to call it, but the film noir light to it. Or then what we're about to get to, the interrogation, the room looks nothing like any room you would ever see in a police department. It's like this blue lighting, it's dark. And again, the fluorescent lights have this grate over it. So everyone's got lines and crosses all over their body. You can just sense the director's like, I just want that look everywhere. Every scene, I want that look. It's not just the key moments. Every single scene, we're going to have that lighting. So they pick up Catherine. I like that she's never like Kathy. She's never Kate. She's always Catherine, which I think is indicating her high status. And they stop by her place to pick her up. And we discover she's got clippings, and we start to learn more about Nick's backstory. And she's investigating Nick. In fact, her next novel is about a story that resembles his story. And maybe we'll just, before we jump into the interrogation, I just wanted to underline again, I think, how absurd the movie is, but fully owns it. So you don't necessarily see the absurdity. But his backstory is that he was an undercover cop and he was so high on cocaine at one point that he accidentally shot dead 2 tourists. And then in the grief, his wife committed suicide. Then he was cleared by IA and is back working.
Yeah. No big deal. Yeah.
No big deal.
And he can say, I'm feeling pretty fine to his psychiatrist.
Yeah. He's back working and then has an affair with the psychologist that's assigned to treat him for whatever he's going through, his drug use, his alcoholism, but he's on the job.
Another interesting thing that Joe had said, the writer, it was actually modeled after a friend of his that was a cop, and that he that actually mortally wounded 2 people in 2 different scenarios, and he could see his friend enjoying it too much. And then the character of Catherine was modeled after someone he was with years back, who he just found like powerful and someone he could not control at all and completely intoxicating. So he had some impetus for this.
Interesting. His script famously sold for $3 million, a spec script for this movie. It was the highest payment for a script up to that point in Hollywood.
Right. Well, there's a lot of drama around the script eventually, but he wrote it in 13 days. Did you read that?
Yeah.
13. I mean, that's...
I hate him. Yeah. Okay, so they pick up Catherine, and her hairstyle in this scene, I just want to note again, is right out of Kim Novak's hairstyle in Vertigo.
Oh, is it?
It's basically an exact replication. Nick watches her dress.
Oh, yes, it is.
Right?
Look at that.
Just even the way it's clipped at the back and it's tight, right? So again, the director is signaling here what conversation he's having with film history. Nick, again, not a good guy, watches a woman dress. He sees that she's naked underneath her dress, like she's not wearing underwear.
Yeah. I was really surprised, even for a character like this, like that's where you see how bold he is and like how unembarrassed. That's the first time that we see on his end, he's brash. Because he really just walks up in plain view of being able to watch her as well. He didn't try to glance sideways or see around a corner. He just stood there.
And we don't think she notices, but we discover later that she did notice. Yeah.
She also didn't try to close the door or make sure that they weren't following or anything. So
Which
thus
tells
the
us
game
something
begins.
about her. Yeah. So they bring her on the drive. That's when some of the lines we've seen in the trailer where she's tempting him to smoke. She's telling him what the story, how this story might end. She's writing a novel about someone like him and the detective dies in the end. And she's just sort of playing with him and tempting him and trolling him in a little bit. So then we get to the interrogation scene, which is, like you said, the scene that the movie is known for. And I think the scene's actually amazing, with or without the vulva shot in it.
Yeah, I know it gets too much focus, but it's like I find many scenes equally interesting to this in the film, but it's a great scene.
So I think there's 5 or 6 men in this interrogation room. She's seated at the front, totally relaxed but powerful. They're all leaning in and questioning her. And as she starts to be upfront about her desires and how she was just sleeping with this character and not embarrassed by that, the camera starts to really move. So again, I don't know that I've ever seen a scene shot like this where the camera is swish panning, it's pushing in. Every shot, the camera's moving. We swish pan over to these guys at this table and then over to these guys. And then we push out on Michael Douglas and we push in on Sharon Stone. And it's just like this jittery movement. And, Wayne Knight's character, the big overweight guy, is just sweating and they're like turned on by her and repulsed by her at the same time. And then she crosses and uncrosses her legs, which just like lights up the room for like in terms of energy. They don't know what to do with it. What did you think of the interrogation scene?
I thought that she took care of them one by one. Like one person would start stepping forward and it would just be like down, down, down until Michael Douglas's, Nick, steps up and finally takes the reins and is like, someone needs to rein in this woman, and challenges her back because she started baiting him anyway, using personal details from his life. And so the cops are saying, do you guys know each other do you know each other previously? But it reminded me of how that old feeling of like a group of men and life is black and white, and then a woman walks in and everything turns to color a little bit, and how that is its own force that is unsettling, kind of, and how normally a woman would feel very intimidated to be in a group of only men, but that she is just using it and reversing it. And yeah, I mean, we see the control tactics and everything, and we see that people can't sit with that each of the cops can't really sit with the divided feelings that they're having, that they're each kind of unseated by their instinct versus their role, the role that they're keeping as a police person.
So there's controversy around this shot of her crossing and uncrossing her legs where you see her vulva. And do you want to describe some of the controversy around shooting that shot and Sharon Stone and the director?
Sure, yeah. Well, she was told that the shot wouldn't actually be in the film, that it was that you want the bare long legs and that there's going to be, but we'll never actually see the vulva. So rumor is that when she actually saw that it was in the film, she went up and slapped him. Do you know anything more about the agreements that they had?
Yeah, she describes it as she was told that her underwear was reflecting with the light, and so they needed her to remove it so that it didn't reflect. And they were implying that she was naked there, but they weren't going to show it. And then they actually did capture that in the shot and then put it in the cut. And then when Sharon Stone, as she describes in her own autobiography, when she saw it, she got really angry. She went and slapped Paul, tried to decide what to do legally. There was some disagreement in terms of like what she could do legally, but on Paul, the director's side, and on her side. The way she tells the story is in the end, she decided to leave it because she thought it was right for the movie. But the director and her have different stories around what was agreed on, what was communicated while shooting it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in this film. So it's interesting how sometimes the narratives that we choose to work with in our lives as actors, or if we're in the periphery of a certain subject matter, it kind of permeates the actual dynamic of the working team. I remember I was friends with someone who was doing the musical Heathers, and they just had completely they started having social organization issues that were so much out of high school. And I can see that the boundaries in this movie and the agreements and the sort of who has control. Does the writer have control? He abdicates because there's adjustments that he doesn't like. The director doesn't acknowledge to the actress that he's going to put in a shot. So there's a lot of the stories around the mythology of Basic Instinct that have some of the themes of the movie.
Yeah, the making of this scene there's a lot of issues around consent, where she didn't consent to that shot, saw it, and then later signed off on it, I suppose, giving consent retroactively. But yeah, which reflects some of the themes of the movie.
Yeah, and you and I were talking about how that's pre-intimacy coordinator and how people see the pros and cons of having intimacy coordinators on set. And I think you and I would probably agree there's more pros than cons. But
Definitely. I'm not sure what the cons are.
Right. Well, I'd read that interview with Michael Douglas, and he was talking about people just being free to be, and that how I think the arguments are usually about spontaneity and the type of dynamic that you get when you're not. But again, it's acting, right?
But you could include that in an agreement and go, here are the lines around which we're going to play this scene, and the actors can come with the intimacy coordinator to agreement of what's okay and what's not, and then have freedom
What's the
within
room
that.
around it? Yeah.
But if you're Michael Douglas, being in one of those scenes is just a different experience than if you're Sharon Stone and you've only had supporting roles, or you're an actor, or Jean Triplehorn hasn't been in a film at this point.
Absolutely. He didn't even want her in it. But, his main excitement was to finally do something that was more sexually explicit. That was one of his main drivers for doing this movie. And of course, it puts both people in a different bind, because Sharon Stone shared she lost custody of her child after this movie. So it might have given her a rise to mega stardom, even though she was famous because of Total Recall. It jettisoned her on a whole level. But then we got the pedestal, the whore Madonna, the kind of we'll give you tons of money and this is what makes you famous. And you can see the men. I saw her being interviewed by Letterman and Dennis Miller and a whole host of people. And it's interesting. It's always the interrogation scene that they show. There's a lot of flirtation about what she's wearing and things like that. And there's a real spectrum of what she has to handle even in those interviews. So for her to see the weight of the impact of the movie and how it changed her life, and it didn't really change Michael Douglas's that much, he was still within the same ballpark, you can already see the power play there, the differences in their lives and position.
It reminds me, and people can look this up on YouTube and other places, but Amy Schumer did a skit where she mocks the over-sexualization of actresses in late-night talk shows and how they're interviewed, and how the relationship between them and the male interviewer and the audience is always they're there to be a sexual object, and does it in a very Amy Schumer way. So she then passes a lie detector test, and Nick agrees to drive her home.
Although there's an interesting little tidbit in that, because Nick's it means nothing. Everyone else is oh, she passed it. We have the wrong gal, and he's no, you can pass it.
Because he did.
Well, yeah, that's the inference, yeah. But again, I don't think they ever leave it that explicit. It's one of those half-truths that the audience has to determine how, is it because Nick saw it done, or is it because Nick has experience?
Again, they have a nice moment in the car where they square off, and it's raining, and the light through the windows is that kind of distorted light through water. And again, it's
the pouring rain. Right?
Light is always slightly distorted. Exactly. So he goes, he's agitated. He's had this intense experience with Catherine. He goes to a bar, and then other cops are there, and he starts to drink again. And he's been on the wagon for a few months. And he falls off the wagon, and the internal affairs investigator who had been investigating him, Nielsen, shows up, and they sort of square off and almost get into a fight.
Yes, and then you see Beth intercede. She happens to be there too, and so you can see how far down the line she is in terms of her affection. And then they make a comment, I think the only reason he's sleeping with that girl is so he doesn't get investigated anymore. The captain and his partner. So it's really I'm boundaries, people. But what's also interesting is the IA investigator keeps coming up as someone provocative, for Nick. Now, if he was wearing a skirt and looked like Sharon Stone, we'd be rocking and rolling. We'd have a sexual dynamic, but this guy's just annoying and someone to dominate. It's like spar with like a stag. And so, but it's not turning on Nick Curran that he's bugging him. So that there's a dynamic there.
So him and Beth then go back to her place. I can't remember whose place it is, her place. And he basically attacks her to have sex.
He's a bit rougher with her in the beginning. And it's great because there's like this progression where you're like, I don't know, for me anyway, I'm sitting there going, am I still okay with this? Am I still okay? And then it escalates and he's bending her over a chair and she clearly says no. And there's this like space until he actually penetrates her and she's not enjoying it and she didn't like it. So you can kind of see her going, oh, like this feels like passion and I love this man and like it's a bit of a surprise, but I'm going to let myself be overwhelmed. I'm going to surrender to it. But that moment for me was a real like, ooh, like really didn't make me like Nick very much. Like I was really grossed out. But what's an extra interesting perspective as well is that the director and the writer both couldn't understand why people would ever see it as a rape scene. And then you see Paul actually, so Joe, the writer, is a really shoot from the hip guy. He did a whole bunch of like airing of the dirty laundry of Basic Instinct. And he shared about the changes in his life because of this movie as well. So he was very clear that him and Paul were like, we were surprised people saw it as a rape scene. But in an interview with Paul and Sharon Stone, when someone asked them, he said, alluded to it as a rape scene, but then said something kind of gray at the end. And I found that really interesting because obviously it was being positioned as that and the movie was already getting a lot of flack that we'll talk about later. But he wasn't, you could tell he was like, yeah, I mean, there's some interpretation about whether that was rape, but he had already alluded to it as such. And I was watching it with my partner and he definitely felt the same way as well. How did it land on you, that whole scene?
Yeah, it seems like a rape scene to me. I shouldn't say seemed. I believe that it is. Because later she says, it wasn't like it was consensual non-consent. Because later she says, you've never done that before. We've never had sex that way before. So this is not something that's a pattern or a way of playing. He just suddenly escalated. She said no, he didn't stop. And I think, again, the point of the film, I think, is Nick is a bad guy. The protagonist of this movie is an asshole, a violent asshole, and we're still kind of cheering for him, so to speak. We're at least following his side of the story. The theatrical cut, I will say, doesn't have her saying no. So that was one of the things they cut. They cut like 40 seconds to go from an NC-17 to a rated R. And that was one of the things they cut. And then they put it back in. You can only find it now in like VHS copies. Everything else, DVDs, is all the unrated cut, so to speak.
I have a story about being a dick and also being liked by audiences.
Go on.
Because when Michael Douglas was filming Fatal Attraction, of course, which is another thriller.
This movie exists, I think, because of Fatal Attraction, because it was such a huge hit.
Right.
Yeah.
So Michael Douglas was describing this scene where he started cheating on his wife and he messes up the bed. He hears her coming home, the wife, and he messes up the bed to look like he slept in it when he's been with Glenn Close, right? Before it gets really bad. And they're in the movie theater at the first screening of Fatal Attraction, and the people laughed when he messes up the bed. And the producer, one of the female producers, leaned over to Michael Douglas and says, I can't believe it, they've already forgiven you. And so there's something in the way he balances that, and his interpretation of that, Michael Douglas's interpretation of that, was that he does portray people who are struggling. And so what they're wrestling with and the quality of their conscience in that might vary. But he's like, if I was just a dick, I wouldn't be likable. But that was their kind of shared interpretation of that.
Right. That reminds me, I think there's another element to that. So Roger Ebert called movies like an empathy generating machine. And I think it's because movies have a very specific point of view, and you are usually brought into the point of view of one or more of the characters. So when you were describing that, what comes to mind is the movie Psycho, again, so Hitchcock film, and the movie famously kills off who you think the protagonist is, spoiler alert, in the first 20 minutes. And then the point of view shifts to Norman Bates. And you're then with the murderer for the rest of the movie. And there's a part at the end of the movie where he's getting rid of the evidence of, as I recall, the bodies in like a trunk of a car, and he's sinking the car, and the car pauses. And the whole audience for sure is like, oh my God, that car needs to sink. We need to hide the body. Right? Because you're in the point of view of
Right.
this character.
You feel the urgency. Yeah.
I don't know that I can speak to like literature and books as much, but in film, because you're seeing through a set of eyes, the camera eyes, and you're seeing what characters see, and there's a way to shoot things so that it's very subjective, it's hard not to root for whoever the main character is.
Which already is a really interesting comment on basic instinct. Like, who are we allied with? And it's the perception, I mean, not to get too lofty, but like, that's the best thing to do in time of war is just dehumanize the other side. The more knowledge and perspective that you have about the other side, the more you're going to naturally ally yourself. So in terms of like basic instinct and how we're like grouped as animals that are very socially inclined, it is very interesting. But I think with Norman Bates as well, you understand the stakes for him. And so that's a little more like Michael Douglas's point about like, there's a real struggle for this person in life. We can feel.
So the story continues and we get more information around one of Catherine's profs that was murdered at Berkeley. And I just want to point out a lot of these scenes are just these gorgeous oneers where the camera just brings this person into the office and then we get a 3-shot and then it moves into a 2-shot and then it finishes with a push on. And it's just like just old school filmmaking where you get it all without cutting. And honestly, it's really gorgeous. We then get into that chase sequence in the hills where he's chasing Sharon Stone's character in her car. Very like Vertigo, Jimmy Stewart and his obsession with the Kim Novak character and just following her. And then we're introduced to Hazel Dopkins. So she's played by Dorothy Malone and has starred in 100 old films, including ones with Kirk Douglas. She won an Oscar for a Douglas Sirk film. She's just, again, signaling that this movie is like in conversation as part of a tradition of films. He watches her undress again at her beach house. And then again, he visits her. And this is where she starts to really try to seduce him. So she uses an ice pick to get ice for their drinks and is like leaning into that. Yeah. She starts to seduce him and but then calls out his guilt around the shooting. And she's calling him shooter a lot now. Like she's antagonizing him as like, you're the one who murdered 2 tourists. But
I killed people maybe, and you've definitely killed people.
Yeah, which again repulses him, but also intrigues him. The way that she's just manipulates.
It's really fun to see them spar. Yeah, it's just so fun to see them spar. Because one thing I did like about how when he has sex with Beth is just, you can tell his lid is gonna blow, and he's got so much pent up in his body. And the charge that he has and the coolness that she has and the provocation is such a beautiful combination.
So in that scene with Catherine, he discovers that she knows details of that, what happened in that shooting that only Beth would know in her reports. So then he confronts Beth. Did you give these reports? Like, who has them? How would she know that? And then we discover Nielsen's been digging around this IA guy, and he was the one who had that information. He starts to really spiral. And for me, it's a theme that I think is going to come up in a few movies that we cover, at least this season. What happens to men when there's a woman that they can't control? That's what I was experiencing with him, is like he's used to just kind of having his way and having someone like Beth pine after him. And this woman is just pulling his strings and he's kind of losing his mind. Then we have Nielsen ends up dead. And he had confronted Nielsen about it. He had accused Nielsen of having his files. Nielsen's found dead, gunshot wound to his head, and Nick gets the interrogation room scene where he's in the room now, the same room that she was in.
Now he's more vulnerable.
He's vulnerable. Beth comes in and rescues him, essentially, claiming that she becomes his alibi, which was true. Partly true. She had visited him the night before. And then as they're walking through the halls, him and Beth, and he's thanking her, there's a moment of like where she's, of course I'm here to support you and everything's okay. And she's sort of very much people-pleasing him. At the very end of the sequence, he walks off and we get a beat with her as she sits in her car. And it's just like a few frames, but her face shifts. And to me, that's one of those first scenes where it's hinting that she knows exactly what she's doing here. She's playing some kind of game. We don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But at least
she has a lingering smile that they've connected for a minute as he walks away, and then her whole face just falls as soon as he turns his back.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Right. So he's smoking, he's drinking, he's driving recklessly, his behavior's out of control at the police station. He's beating people up, and he's really starting to pursue Catherine more.
Yeah, and Catherine's even waiting at his home when he gets back. And again, there's a push-pull with her. She pushes him away, she pulls him towards. She's just like playing him all the time.
And she's dressed differently. She's worried about him. She's got a pinch of Beth in her. She's saying, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about this investigation. She's in more casual wear.
There's a moment where he's trying to show his power, where he's like, so where is this going? What do you want from me? And then she actually says, ask me again. Like he's trying to like exert some power and say that he's in control. And then she makes him repeat the question, which I just thought was another interesting play. Like so many of these scenes are about a power dynamic and who's controlling the energy.
And who gets to ask the questions.
Who
right?
gets to
Like
ask the questions.
Yeah.
That's right. In her interrogation, she starts asking questions. I wanted to point out that his apartment building, or whatever the building that he lives in, the staircase is right out of the staircase from Vertigo. And it's played a little more obviously later, but
I'm so glad you found those pieces. That's cool.
So then he visits her at the club, and then they go back to her place, and then we have the sex scene between the two of them.
Do you want to talk about the club or not so much?
Sure, yeah. What stood out for you at the club?
Well, there's a kind of, it starts with her and Roxy being very sensual and getting high in the bathroom with another person, and then being sensual on the dance floor. And then she slowly starts dancing towards him, and Roxy's not very happy at all. Michael Douglas apparently got a lot of questions about his outfit in that scene, and it's always been a mind-boggling for him.
It's liked or not liked?
That people don't get why he's wearing that shirt.
The
And he's like,
V-neck.
yeah. He's like, I don't know, I trust a wardrobe. But you see that she's choosing him over Roxy, which hasn't been you see how quickly she's willing to let go of someone that she's been with. And then, of course, we haven't seen them be that intimate before. We've seen them around each other, so.
Yeah, so then they leave. Roxy is jealous. And this is the halfway point of the movie. So the movie's been building towards this. It started with an intense sex scene that ended in violence. Then it had some just like sexual titillation, I suppose, from Catherine as she's manipulating. But here's the scene. And it sort of gives the audience what they've been looking for up to this point.
And it's gorgeous. I actually love all their sex scenes, I think. I'm trying to think, but like, especially the overhead ones. There's something, I'm really a sucker for overhead fucking shots. It's so beautiful. Like entwined bodies. I thought it was really
Which was the opening
nice
shot of the
sex.
movie. It was a mirror shot, the overhead
Them
reflection.
I was less excited about, but like, yeah. Nick and Catherine have some nice sex.
So and it basically reenacts the sex scene from the start of the movie.
Yeah, and she does lean back and thrust.
She
at
ties
some
him
point.
up.
She ties him up.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I mean, not who in their right mind, because that's not exactly the sentence, but I mean, the suspense that builds when he is getting tied up, and they just set you up so well because she does the whole lean back grunting thing, and that's exactly when the earlier person took the knife. But I'm really curious why he would let himself get tied up.
Well, he describes later that was part of the excitement. Like it was that there was a risk of death. This was another scene that was cut for the theatrical release. So the version that we saw has very clear oral sex with Nick going down on her, like a close-up almost over her belly. And that was not in the theatrical release. So that was what was cut to get the R rating. As people have pointed out, there's other shots where it's clear that she's going down on him, and those did not have to be cut. They're more wide shots. Those didn't have to be cut.
They're at kind of the lower belly line. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an overhead reflection shot too, but just that there is some of that patriarchal thinking, like in even the ratings board at that time,
yeah,
right?
Of course.
Like we can show her giving oral sex, but we can't show him giving oral sex. We can show her vulva if men are ogling at it. We can't show him giving it pleasure, you know? So there's definitely some hypocrisy there in the way that ratings were given out. Yeah, so the thing that crossed my mind as I'm watching this, in a kind of conventional Hollywood or conventional film storytelling, the halfway point, you sort of get like a false victory or a false defeat. Things go the way of what the character thinks they're supposed to go, or they don't go. And then the rest of the movie is kind of unpacking what actually needs to happen.
Huh, interesting.
So it's not clear to me if this is a false victory or a false defeat. Is this a win for Nick or a loss for Nick?
Well, that beach scene is awesome, which is what I meant by the interrogation scene. I think the beach scenes are really neat.
So the next scene, he wakes up, she's not there, and he goes to see her. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, well, he's excited because he thinks that they're going to reunite and that they're passionate and that they've really found their match, and he's lit up, and he sees Roxy go by not looking happy, so that bolsters him further. And then he actually meets Catherine, and she's, lukewarm. She's relaxed about everything. And so he starts asking her questions like, well, what did you think? Like, what did you think last night was? Because, and not in an insecure way, and he says, I thought it was the fuck of the century. What about you? I think she says, yeah, I had a nice orgasm.
Yeah, okay.
That's good.
Just because I had an orgasm doesn't mean I'm going to tell you all my secrets.
Yeah. And she's both open and untouchable. So I think it's really interesting. She's got like no makeup on. She's in her element. She's at her home. We don't know what's just proceeded with Roxy, but she's not ruffled or inspired or more melted by their experience together. So.
Mm-hmm. And then he starts to try to exert power by saying he's going to catch her, and he knows she's the murderer, and she's just plays it completely cool.
Yeah. First he tries to define it, and when that doesn't work, like defining the connection that they just had, and then he intimidates.
I remember even like seeing versions of this scene in the past where it's like he describes the fuck of the century. And it's like, again, this is just one of those lines that it's Michael Douglas. So he's saying it's the fuck of the century. But when you think about it, it's such a immature, boyish thing to say.
Mm-hmm. You don't think it fits?
It fits his character. But I think, again, it just reveals that he's just being played, that he's like not that deep. Like, they had sex once and he's like, it's the fuck of the sentence. Like that's his peak for him. I don't know. It reveals a naivete to that character for me, and which she then exposes.
Yes.
Yeah. In that scene, a narcissism. Yeah. So then we go to a cowboy bar, which I think is hilarious because it's like, I don't know. Are there cowboy bars in San Francisco? I'm not.
I didn't spend much time there when I was there.
And then we, Gus and him start to unpack. He meets Gus there, who's got his cowboy hat on, and they start to unpack more of what's
Gus
going on.
Is pissed, said
Gus
Nick.
is pissed.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a little bit of Verhoeven poking fun at Americana. And then Roxy tries to run him over with the car outside. And it's actually then he gets in a car and there's this car chase, and then eventually Roxy's car plummets off this overpass or something. And it's for me again, gorgeously shot. Like there's this outdoor, it's construction, it's an overpass. He's talking with the captain and her body gets like lifted up on a wire up in the background.
Right,
and it's
to get her out of the gully.
lit. Incredible set.
Yeah, it's true. But he's the first person there, and the captain shows up.
So after Roxy dies, we find out more information about Roxy. Catherine opens up and she describes this classmate called Lisa Oberman. Nick goes and researches it. And eventually after back and forth, we discover that was Beth. Beth has this connection to Catherine in the past. And things started to come to the surface. Nielsen had been investigating Beth. Beth had slept with Catherine in the past. It's all very convoluted. I think it does make sense when you slow down. There's a scene where Nick and Gus basically explain the movie, like they're on a waterfront pier. Gorgeously lit shot at night. And it's just them explaining the movie up to this point, which is helpful. But there is one thing that Gus says where he says, you think you can fuck like minks, raise rugrats, and live happily ever after. And so this was the question I had for you as I was watching this. It feels like Sharon Stone's character is a kind of like version of the manic pixie dream girl. So not that she's a manic pixie dream girl, but there's a sense in which Nick is like projecting onto her what he thinks this woman is now bringing into his life. That they're going to have this romantic connection and they're going to live happily ever after.
Yeah, well, Gus is pointing out he has no idea what her position is in life. So it's like fantasy versus the reality. Like Gus almost says the male equivalent to what she said on the beach.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is like part of where, to me, the battle of this film lies, which is the cultural battle, which is Catherine Trammell an image of female empowerment or a male fantasy? And before I ever saw the film, I just assumed the latter. And for me, as I watched the film, she's the one pulling all the strings here. I don't think she's a projection of what these guys, like, I don't know. They're definitely projecting onto her what they think she is, what they want her to be, but she never succumbs to that projection. She holds the power herself each time. What do you think about the sort of battle for who Catherine Trammell is in the culture?
Well, I think it's a matter of perspective, meaning they can, kind of like Marilyn Monroe, right? Like people have all these ideas about her, but it wasn't that she was unintelligent or not profound, or, she had her own reality behind that fantasy. And in that sense, Catherine is refreshing because she doesn't have structural power, which usually means that women try to get power through manipulation. She's overt. So there's something refreshing. It's like if men could have sex with, like if cis men could have sex with men. There's something in terms of like gay relationships that not everyone likes or feels, but that men I've spoken to have said, there is just something nice to being on Grindr or being able to have straight up sex. And I don't know how you do it, cis people, because it just doesn't need to mean that much. And there's so much more pleasure that you could be having. So in that sense, Catherine serves up an ability to be completely sexual without any of the vulnerabilities or the tactics that women normally employ in order to get some type of voice or visibility. But again, it would be very interesting to see a woman do that who doesn't have money. When
Right,
you
she's
have your
incredibly
own,
wealthy in this story.
yeah, and then you are less vulnerable in that sense.
She does have structural power
She has structural
in this
power
story,
and
even if
authority.
she's being investigated.
Yeah, and especially if we believe the implication of the movie, and she's actually making Nick more and more vulnerable in terms of his, like with the murder of the AI investigators. And again, it's so layered because it's when this movie came out, interesting to have a person portrayed like that, like a woman portrayed like that. But it's a bit of a pendulum swing. It's like in the evolution of empowerment, we usually try to do with the oppressive force, like there's mimicry before there's actual empowerment. So we would call that, like in psychology or systems theory, we call that first order change. So it's not second order change. It's not actually that the roles have changed. It's just who's in the roles. So they would call that rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing, right? The ship's still going down. But again, that's really value-based, and that's a deeper conversation I'm not sure that the film is trying to have. I think it's more about what's ticking inside us that we're willing to look at or not. But I still think it's interesting for us.
We can just mention at this point that the script did get out before they shot the movie, and there was some controversy around it because here was Sharon Stone's playing this lead character who's overtly bisexual, and Beth to a certain extent as well, and she's potentially a murderous psychopath. And so there were groups that literally protested the film as it's shooting, trying to disrupt production because they didn't appreciate that bisexual characters always have to be like that. They can't just be one of the main normal characters. They have to have some
I could see
negative.
that being painful.
Yeah.
It's the same argument of like, does my orientation have to be so much about this, of this character? Like, can I not just be a person on a journey who happens to have this orientation? Right. There's a lot of those conversations. But I don't think Sharon Stone or Catherine Trammell were in a different position either.
Tell me more.
Well, I think it would be nice to see a sexually empowered woman who isn't murdering people too.
Right.
And that's not to discredit. I understand how we start to bring narratives forward. It would be like, wouldn't it be wonderful in the 60s to see a Russian person portrayed in a really complex and beautiful way in a Hollywood movie, right? Like Cold War turned on its head.
Well, I can think of one example. But,
Yeah, great.
Well, Norman Jewison's The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming.
Oh, well, Norman Jewison is doing that, though.
Yeah,
that's
that's
his
what he
whole
does.
point.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, God, I love him. But it is complex because even Sharon Stone, she's like, you don't usually get to play a woman in film. That's what she said at the time. She said, you usually have to play a man's interpretation of a woman or fantasy of what that woman is. She's like, so it didn't feel different to her.
So even in this film, she felt like she was playing a fantasy, or?
I think she was excited to have something meatier that wasn't only that. I think she did think that more was going on, but that the movie was playing with that, and that her history to date, like people were like, oh, well, how do you feel about how much your body is seen and everything? She's like, but that's the gig. You're always playing fantasy. So at least it's on the table.
So we'll just jump ahead here. And as we get to the end of the film, we've unpacked, there's information about Nielsen and Beth, and Nick's done more investigation into it. It definitely seems like Beth is a suspect on multiple levels. And then Catherine announces that her book is done. So she's done with Nick. And again, this was one of those, this is absurd moments, which I embrace in the film because I think the film is filled with, like, I'm obviously making fun of this genre, everyone. Can you see? Because the timeline of this movie is a few weeks, perhaps. And she's finished her book and it's printing on the dot matrix printer as if that's how book publishing works. The cover page is already done. She's done the book and she's done with Nick. And he's, again, this is where I think the film is portraying a really powerful woman that the men just can't keep up with, can't control, keep wanting to put her in a box. She won't be put in a box. And his, like, the way that he pouts when she breaks up with him, so to speak, turns into anger and real, almost violence, because he just can't handle that she's done it again to him.
Right. It's another nod at that baser instinct, right? You scratch the surface of being in love and then you get demon behavior.
That's right. And so then we move into the kind of final sequence of the film, which is he's drinking again. He's just distraught because this woman won't love him. And then Gus pulls up and they've got a lead, and it's Beth's old roommate or whatever the detail is that they're going to meet at this apartment, and she's going to testify against Catherine and Lisa Hoberman / Beth. And
they're trying to clarify whether Catherine's right about Beth or Beth's right about Catherine.
That's right.
Which is just awesome.
And so they drive together to this apartment complex, but Nick can't go in because he's not a cop. Why Gus picked him up, I don't know. But Nick can't go in because he's not a cop.
So far, he's never listened to any kind of directive.
That's right.
And his job has been at risk forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he's had to give in his badge and his gun, and he's been suspended. That's one thing we didn't cover. So Gus goes in, and then Nick's outside, and it's so Hitchcockian, this whole sequence, because it's like, it's so slow. Like, we follow Gus into the elevator, and we're just like, this is this long shot of him in the elevator. And then he looks at the first, and the door keeps opening at each
floor.
And it's just the classic Hitchcockian, like, metaphor of, like, the ticking time bomb under the table, where we know something's going to happen. And then Nick wakes up to, I don't know, this is bad, and starts screaming at Gus from outside the building as if he's going to hear him, which he's not anyways. But he runs in the building.
Is part of what tipped him off, I seem to remember there being a script where the best friend of the cop dies on Catherine Trammell's desk. And I remember being like, he's going to die.
I didn't even note that.
There goes Gus.
So maybe that's what he's thinking about.
Okay.
He's remembering details from the book.
Right.
But he runs in too late. We see Gus, the doors open, and it's right out of Psycho. It's this tilted shot with the ice pick coming down, murdering Gus in the elevator. The person seems to have blonde hair and an overcoat over top. And then Nick comes in and finds the body. And then all of a sudden, Beth is there. And her excuse is, well, I got a message saying I'm supposed to meet somebody here. I can't remember, meet someone here or Gus there or something. Yes. And he's like, he thinks maybe this is Beth did this, and he's pulled the gun on her and he's telling her to stop, and she's reaching into her pocket. She won't stop, and he shoots her dead. And as she dies, she's like, I still love you, or I love you, or something like that. And then it turns out it was just keys in her pocket. The cops arrive. Clearly,
again, the captain's like, why are you here?
Yeah. They find the wig on the stairs with the jacket. And this is a very Brian De Palma moment of, like, the wig and murder and woman. And then everything just, like, wraps up perfectly. So this was, again, for me, this sort of heightened satire of film noir that I think he's pulling. There's a shot at the end where there's a press conference at the police department. We track inside, and this guy comes up and, like, yep, the jacket is Beth's size. And then we find out, yep, the roommate died 2 years ago. This is all one shot. And then, yep, the gun in Beth's apartment is a match for Nielsen. Yep, the ice pick checks out. And then, yep, Beth's reason, she said she had a message on her answering machine. There was no messages on her answering machine. And there's more connections between Boz and Beth. And meanwhile, Nick is just off to the side of each of these frames, just sitting there quietly. And then...
so we don't know if things are planted or whether they're Beth's.
But the movie's going, yep, it's all solved. Yeah. Beth was the murderer.
Exactly, yeah.
And the lieutenant is like, you just can't tell about people, can you? Even the ones you think you know inside and out. And then it's all been one shot. And the captain comes into this tight close-up and was like, congratulations, Curran. And then we cut to Michael Douglas, and he's just devastated. But it's like, it's an absurd scene.
Right, yes.
Where everything is wrapped up perfectly.
There's no longer any skepticism about anyone.
This is all the evidence points to.
Nick's forgiven somehow.
Yeah. And then we come back to his home, and this is where we see the staircase and we have this overhead shot as he comes up to his room, and it is the Vertigo staircase. Like the frame is identical. And Catherine is waiting, and she, cries and like suggests that she just pushes people away. And, she really, it's like, I want to be loved. I want to love, but I can't love him. These aren't her words.
Yeah. But, I'm an orphan, basically. And I just wanted to write. That's why I surround myself with sociopaths.
Yeah. And then we have, once again, him asking if they can have the happily ever after. He keeps going back to that. Like he's just this little boy who just like wants someone to love him and to live happily ever after. And we have this sex scene that again mirrors the opening one and the halfway one, where is she going to murder him? And then they have the conversation. He asks for the happily ever after, and there's this weird look on her face. She doesn't, and then the final shot is this, it tracks down and we see the ice pick is under the bed.
Yeah. There's a really great moment where Michael Douglas turns his back and like the audience.
Is this it?
That's a very Hitchcockian thing, right?
Totally.
Let the audience hold the tension. Don't telegraph too much. And then it pans down.
And the final shot is an ice pick. So did Beth do it?
I have no idea. I have no idea because, it's funny. It came down to like my partner, Martin. He was saying, well, if you actually look at, they said that the ice pick that was used in the murders was actually just like $3 at some store. But Catherine Trammell has really fancy ones. So it can't have been her all along. And it's also, and I thought that was really interesting because we were trying to, you get granular about it. You're like, what could it be? And there's also an argument for, is this actually part of the lust between Beth and Catherine? Is that they compete, they mirror each other? Is this a double murder kind of thing? But I like the ambiguity. What about you? Who done it?
I don't know. I would lean towards Beth, I think, only because she's the one character that the movie is, I don't know what the right word is, waffling on. She's just a chameleon. I think the movie's clear that she's a chameleon.
Because she's not holding a solid center of herself, you mean?
She just
Right.
plays, the Catherine Trammell character I think is more clearly manipulative, overtly manipulative, and Beth's character it's covertly manipulative through fawning, accommodation. I don't know. I mean, obviously you could make a perfectly decent argument for either one.
Which is why the film's so fun. And they're from different power positions, right?
Totally.
Like we've discussed. Power tactics.
So I interpret the film as a Verhoeven going, look, America has this tradition of film noir with these specific tropes around femme fatale, men who just can't stop pursuing the woman, guilt, shame. But traditionally, the sexuality of those movies was always just hinted at. You couldn't show it because of the Hays Code. And I think of movies like Double Indemnity, which is definitely being played and like is being paid homage to in this movie, where deeply sexual and the male character is driven purely for his own lustful gains. Whatever, it's in the 50s, you can't show any of that. And I feel like Verhoeven is going, what if I just showed you everything that happens off screen? And we put as much sex in this movie as we can, and we show you exactly what it is that you've been consuming in terms of entertainment, being an outsider as this Dutch filmmaker. And I'm going to make it as absurd as possible, but I'm going to have Michael Douglas saying the lines, and I'm going to have one of the best cinematographers of the 80s and 90s shooting this movie so it looks gorgeous. So I interpret the film as this like cultural mirror that's in conversation with this film tradition. So it's just this satire of film noir. But the question I had was, even if you don't agree with that position, is that valuable? Because I'm thinking the film was people either yelled at it or jerked off to it. I do think it deconstructed the genre so that no film ever could really, even if they played with it like Jade or other films afterwards, Basic Instinct was kind of like jumping the shark essentially. But a film like that, is there value in a cultural mirror like that?
Well, unexamined too. Like it pushed debate, which is awesome, and it left it with the audience. Yeah, is there value? I mean, I love your lens on it, and I also think that there's something in how Paul hands it back to the audience, knowing that they were safe within not being involved in any of the choices that Nick and Catherine would make, but we might be rooting for them. We might be turned on. We might be rooting for one woman and not the other. And so our personal drives are coming into it. I love that part.
A bit of a Rorschach test for ourselves.
That's a good way to see it. Yeah. And to say, also don't put it on Nick and Catherine. Like there's some people who are willing to do the things that we all have within us, and some people who are doing it covertly and some people who are doing it overtly, but that's part of the potential that we hold. Yeah. I don't know how to answer the question around value, but I think it's a great one.
Yeah, I think I wonder if a film like this, it's one of those films that the value comes out over time. So there's been a reclamation of the film as it's not just trash. It's actually intentional artistic trash that had served a purpose, and you might not see it for a decade. And is that valuable? I think so, even if this is why I like conversations like this, just to bring it to the forefront that there's more going on than just TNA.
Absolutely.
The film is actually playing with some interesting ideas and throwing them back at the audience to think about. We've covered a lot of scenes here. Are there, besides the interrogation scene, you really like the beach scene, are there other scenes that you think of and go, that's just a great scene? You could watch that scene over and over again. Sounded like the sex scene because you really liked it.
Oh, yeah. I could watch those. And I wasn't yelling. No, I'm kidding. I think it's beautiful. In a way that we talked about the movie Bliss before. Bliss had kind of more tender, but it has that same beautiful, the passionate lovemaking. I love watching sex. I just think it's beautiful. I just love it. I don't love it all equally, but... No, I think the favorite takeaway of the film is how perfectly it balances both women and us not knowing. I think this film is trying to say, do you like being played with? And put us in that position of the cat, right?
Yes, including not just the characters, the story, but this genre and this style of storytelling. Are you not entertained? Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, the mirror is there. And I kept thinking of Jack Moran's book, which is one of my favorite books about sexuality of all time, The Erotic Mind, and how he talks about these 4 different pathways of how we generate arousal within our system and where that comes from. And one of them is overcoming inhibitions, right? So the fact it's an obstacle-obsessed state where you're so happy to break the rules and to not have to conform to anything, then that is the most titillating thing. And I think this movie's chock full of those. And maybe there's also one quadrant that's about anticipation. And I think the way the slow build of them finding, and then actually it might have all of them. So another one is overcoming power. So I think there's a huge checklist of some of the major drives that anyone might have when they're engaging with their sexuality, whether they're willing to live it or not.
So it's a good companion book for this movie.
Good, if you want to go deep, yeah.
So to finish off, it sounds like you would recommend it.
I would recommend it. Who knew? Who knew that I would? Yeah. Oh, there's this quote that I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, final thoughts, things we missed.
Final thoughts. So the quote is, a great man once said, everything is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. And I think that's a bit of a summary of this movie.
Is that Oscar Wilde?
I don't know. Where I did hear it was on House of Cards. Frank said it, and I just loved it, but I don't know who said it.
Yes, I've heard it attributed to Oscar Wilde.
Ah, okay.
But you're absolutely right. That applies to this movie.
I don't know that I agree. I think it's intriguing. I think it leaves me in the same place as the movie does, of going I could totally see that being the truth.
I would say the great films, the films that hold up, are usually about one idea, and every scene is that idea.
Reinforcing it.
Yeah, that idea is being explored. Usually, to riff from Robert McKee, there's the positive element of that or the negative element, and the scenes go back and forth and back and forth. And I think it'd be interesting if people are going to watch this film or watch it again, just to watch every scene through the lens of power and who is wielding power, who's trying to wield power, the tactics they're using to wield power, and just explore the film from that angle. I think that might be quite fruitful. You referenced earlier that I think of this as a masterpiece, and the reason is because I think it's perfectly tuned into what it's trying to accomplish. Each scene pops, even when it's exposition. The cinematography is gorgeous. The music is signifying what it's about, and the actors are dialed into the kind of outrageous tone of the film. So the whole film works for me, and it's this perfect reflection of what American film noir has been toying with for decades, which is the mix of sexuality and violence. And Verhoeven gives the genre its full textual expression of those things and sort of reflects it back to us. I think by exposing what film noir is and empowering the central female character with overt agency, it somehow both constructs and deconstructs the erotic thriller and film noir in a way that kind of jumps the shark so that nothing else could really compete or compare with it for quite some time. I mean, how on earth do you follow up in this genre in the 90s without falling short? So I think Verhoeven is essentially daring us to see the satire. And not surprisingly, despite this artistry, the film just evoked outrage which I think also exposes our hypocrisy. We like these things hinted at, but don't actually want them shown to us.
I think there's also something about like embracing everything that is. The writer had talked about writing Catherine as an omnisexual. So like fucking everything, fucking life, fucking tragedy, fucking, doesn't matter the gender, doesn't matter the situation. And I think that's why we love her, is because she's willing to be larger than the life that she was dealt. And so I think that's part of what makes us on side with Catherine. So that idea of just like continuing to open, continuing to don't let life fuck you, fuck life. And what does that mean?
Yeah, I think we ended there. What a great final thought. Great discussion. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please remember to rate, review, and follow, and please share the podcast to anyone you think would enjoy it. Remember to click the link in the show notes to take my Hidden Relationship Patterns quiz to receive your personalized ebook to start improving your relationships today. And reach out if you need support. Thanks for listening. See you next time.